Today we'll be talking about the geography and history of the ancient Near East. In this video, we'll begin with terms to know, before talking about the geography of the ancient Near East, focusing on Israel's situation in the ancient Near East, and the history of the ancient Near East, beginning with the early Bronze period through the Roman period. We'll conclude by talking about the Enuma Elish and Epic of Gilgamesh, two epics that have important connections with texts in the Hebrew Bible. Before we get into talking about the geography of the ancient Near East, there are a few terms that we should know to work with. The first of these is Israel. Israel is the name of the nation that the Jews in the Hebrew Bible come to inhabit. It's also the name of Jacob when he is renamed by God. The name Israel gives itself to two people groups. The first are Israelis. These are people who live in modern-day Israel, the nation that was formed in 1948. On the other hand, Israelites are people who lived in ancient Israel. These are the people that we'll be focusing on when we talk about the geography and history in this video. Judah is another nation after it splits from Israel, and is also the name of one of the sons of Jacob and one of the tribes of Israel. This name lends itself to three terms that we should know. The first of these is Judaism. Judaism is the religious tradition that we talk about in this video, that formed in the 6th century BCE during the diaspora, in which the Jews fled from their homeland when the first temple was destroyed. Jewish is an adjective that refers to anything that's part of this religious tradition, such as a ritual that's part of Judaism would be called a Jewish ritual. Jews are people who adhere to this religious tradition. These three terms are not used in the Hebrew Bible, but are important to know in moving forward when we talk about the geography and history of the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. When we talk about the geography of the ancient Near East, we're going to focus particularly on the nation of Israel. The ancient Near East is an area that refers to much of the ancient world that you've heard of. Egypt up into where Babylonia was, and the Akkadians, Sumerians, the Greeks, and so on. It's in this area that we find the Israelites, in this area right here. The ancient Near East is often referred to as the Levant, in an effort to make history less Western-centric, but Levant simply means east, so our distinction here is not that different. Israel is what we find in the Hebrew Bible often referred to as the Promised Land, and is located in the vicinity of Canaan. In the ancient world, Canaan was simply a collection of city-states, so Israel was one of these. More particularly, Israel is located in what we call the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is deemed this because it is crescent-shaped, and because it is fertile from the rivers and waterways that flow through it, making it a great place for agriculture. Within the Fertile Crescent, we find Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is where many ancient people groups settled, like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Sumerians. Mesopotamia comes from the Greek, meso and potama, meaning in the middle of the rivers. To give you an idea of the size of Israel, it was about the size of Vermont in the United States, about 9,000 square miles. If you've ever driven through Vermont, you'll know that it's a relatively small state, so Israel was not that big. At this time, nations did not have clear boundaries like we do with the states. Nations were interlinked a bit, and the boundaries were more fluid. As we focus in even more on ancient Israel, we should look at the topography of the area. There's 6 major regions of ancient Israel. The first of these is the coastal plains. The coastal plains contain the city of Philistia, where we get the Philistines from. It was from the Mediterranean Sea on the west coast to the east, which was marshy in antiquity. The second area is the Shephelah. This means the lower part or foothills. This was simply an area between the coastal plain and the central hill country that we get here. This hill country or central highlands is where we find most of the major cities. You can see this map over here shows you some of the major ones, like Shechem, Samaria, Jerusalem, and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. As we move further over, we get to the Rift Valley, or Jordan Rift. This is the area that contains most of the waterways of ancient Israel, including the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee. There's a natural boundary in the east because of the drop in elevation between the Jordan River and the plains on the east. This large area over here is the Transjordanian Highlands, or Plateau. This is the area where we find many of the people groups mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, like the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Gileadites, and the Bashanites. Finally, we have an area south of the hill country here, called Negev, and Sinai is down here as well. This area is what we think of when we think of the desert areas of the Hebrew Bible. There was a lack of rainfall here, and it was sparsely populated because of this. We often think about the areas that we talk about in the Hebrew Bible as deserts, dry, and hot. But the climate of ancient Israel was not that much different from what we might experience in the United States today. Average temperatures ranged from about 86 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This has been consistent for about 10,000 years. There was a major rainy season from late fall to early spring, and a dry season from late spring to early fall. It was rainier in the west, as we see here with the sea, and drier in the east as we get to the plateau and the highlands. Israel grew, produced, and raised several different types of food and animal products. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the major produce that we find in ancient Israel consist of olives, grapes, and grains, particularly barley. They also raised sheep and goats. These were often exported to Egypt as part of the trade market, and would be traded with other things which would be brought into ancient Israel. In Exodus, we find this phrase that Israel was the land flowing with milk and honey. When we think of milk and honey, we probably think of cow milk and bee honey, but this is not what the ancient Israelites would have had. Milk was probably from a sheep or goat, and honey, instead of something made by bees, was probably more like a jam, something that was boiled and strained from grapes or dates. There were two major roadways that Israel used to trade with other nations. These extended from Egypt in the south to Damascus in the north. The first of these, marked by the red, is the way of the land of the Philistines. The second, on the right, is the King's Highway. As mentioned earlier, the boundaries of Israel differ depending on the source, but Israel was very close to both of these roadways, no matter what the boundaries of the nation were. As we move into our discussion of the history of the ancient Near East, we will be focusing on Israel and its situation in the history and politics of major world players in the ancient Near East, rather than every event. We will be talking about the early Bronze Age, beginning around 3300 BCE, through the Roman period ending in about 330 CE. While we do not have much extra-biblical evidence for the events in the Bible, we will hit on some of the major points that we have proof of or conjecture about. The early Bronze Age, lasting from about 3300 to 2000 BCE, was the time of Egyptian colonization. The Sumerians dominated southern Mesopotamia, and eventually were taken over by the Akkadians. During this time, Ur is a major city. As you might know from Hebrew Bible narratives, Abraham was from the city of Ur, so his story may have factored into this time period. The Middle Bronze Age, from about 2000 to 1550 BCE, was when the Babylonians controlled most of Mesopotamia and northern Syria. During this time, there are stories of the Hyksos taking over. The Hyksos were a small people group who many think were actually ancient Israel. During this time, the Hittites captured Babylon and took over this major nation. As we transition into the Late Bronze Age from 1550 to 1200 BCE, we find that the Hyksos are expelled from Egypt. This is one of the things that people point to when saying that the Hyksos were actually the ancient Israelites. If historical, many scholars date Exodus to this time period, around the mid-13th century BCE. The time of Ramesses II was during the Late Bronze Age, and there's a mention of Israel and Ramses' defeated foes. The Iron Age lasted from 1200 to 600 BCE. The Iron Age saw the collapse of major empires like the Egyptians and the Hittites. It also saw the rise of the Philistines, and this is the time that Israel would have become a monarchy. This was also the time when Israel split into two nations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, after the sins of Solomon and the divine mandate. During this time, in 924 BCE, Shishak of Egypt invaded Palestine. The Assyrians captured and destroyed Samaria and laid siege to Jerusalem. While the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed during the Iron Age, the Neo-Babylonian period saw the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah, the city of Jerusalem, and the temple in 586 BCE, leading to the Babylonian diaspora. Babylon destroyed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in 612 as well. Despite the greatness of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Persians under Cyrus the Great captured the Babylonians in 539 BCE. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persian period saw the Jews returning to Israel and rebuilding their temple. After the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, during which we have Alexander the Great taking over many areas and nations, was when the Jews struggled with keeping their identity. It was during this time that the Maccabean revolt occurred. The last period that's of note to us in our study of the Hebrew Bible is the Roman period. Beginning in 63 BCE, when the Romans took over for the Greeks, and ending in the fall of the Roman Empire in 330 CE, the Roman period saw the Romans capturing Jerusalem and driving the Jews out of their homeland and destroying their temple in 70 CE. As we study the geography and history of the ancient Near East, we should ask how we know what we know about these ancient peoples. One of the ways that we know this is through archaeology. Scholars and archaeologists are able to date different events, geographical structures, time periods, and so on through the use of strata and what they find in those strata. Strata are layers that are found in the earth, and each time period will have a different layer that is separate from the first. Different societies build on top of what they found earlier to make their own places, and archaeologists are able to dig back through these layers to find the previous societies, goods, coins, and pottery. This is an example of what strata might look like. For example, this sandstone layer could be the Roman period. This conglomerate layer could be the Hellenistic period, and the granite layer could be the Persian period. How scholars determine this through digging back through these layers is by, for example, finding a coin from the Persian period in this granite layer. By looking at the coin and determining that this is Darius, who was one of the Persian emperors, archaeologists could date this layer to the Persian period. If we look back at our timeline, we find that the Hellenistic period occurs directly after the Persian period. Therefore, if an archaeologist were to find this pottery in the conglomerate layer, they might be able to determine that this is the Hellenistic layer. Anything from this layer comes from the Hellenistic period. They can also use the pottery, coins, and other artifacts to distinguish dates and other dig sites. So if, for example, this pottery was found at a different dig site, say 100 miles away, because of the similarities between this pottery and the one on the left, archaeologists could determine that this is also from the Hellenistic period, helping them date the entire layer in that dig site and determine the timeline of events in that dig site as well, being able to determine Persian period, Roman period, and so on. There are a couple important literary works to talk about when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, because of the similarities between these ancient Near East literary works and some of the stories we find in the Hebrew Bible. The first of these is the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is named for the first couple words of the story, which mean when on high. The Enuma Elish tells the story of Marduk creating humans, but before that tells of the creation of the world by Apsu, the freshwater god, and Tiamat, the saltwater god. In the ancient world, salt water was associated with chaos. These two gods combined their waters to create other gods. However, Apsu was upset with their children because the children made a lot of noise. He decided that he would kill their children, which made Tiamat upset. Apsu decided not to because of what Tiamat said, and the children ended up killing Apsu instead. Tiamat became very angry with this and decided to create a monster army to kill her children and restore creation back to what it was originally. However, Marduk, one of their descendants, decided to slay Tiamat. When he did so, he created the universe from her body and made her eyes into stars and used her torso to create worlds and galaxies. Marduk and Ea created humankind, but instead of creating humankind because they wanted to, they created them to be servants and slaves to the gods. This text was originally written in Akkadian, and it is celebrated in the Akitu festival of the Babylonians and Akkadians and Assyrians. The Akitu festival was the Babylonian New Year, and it celebrated the relationship between the humans and their gods. Again, this was more of a fearful relationship, as the Enuma Elish established that humanity was created to be slaves to the gods. The Epic of Gilgamesh is another important literary work of the ancient Near East, primarily because of its connections to the flood story in Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the tale of Gilgamesh, a king of Uruk who is 1/3 human and 2/3 divine. Gilgamesh is the ruler of Uruk, but is a horrible king. He rules the people cruelly, rapes whomever he pleases, kills whomever he pleases, and takes whatever he pleases. The gods recognize Gilgamesh's horribleness and decide to create somebody to be his friend to help bring him to being human. They create Enkidu out of clay and set him in a paradise of sorts. Here, Enkidu runs with animals and drinks with animals. Eventually, a hunter comes upon him and recognizes that he is more animal than human. To tame him, they send Shamhat, a temple prostitute, to have sex with Enkidu for a week to bring him to become human. Of course, this works, and Enkidu recognizes what humans do. He gains wisdom and understanding of the world around him, and according to Shamhat, becomes like a god. Enkidu and Gilgamesh become friends, and Gilgamesh becomes a better person. But eventually, Enkidu dies, which sets Gilgamesh on a quest for immortality. In his search for immortality, Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is a Noah of sorts in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who has experienced a great flood. Utnapishtim was warned by one god that the rest of the gods were sending a flood to destroy all of humanity. Utnapishtim gathered his family, his friends, his animals, and everything that he could, and put it onto this ark to save it from this great flood that the gods sent. This worked, and humanity was not endangered as it was in the Noah flood story. At the end of this work, Gilgamesh finds the secret to immortality, but our two focuses are on this story of the flood and the story of Enkidu and this paradise-like garden. The Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, is an epic. An epic is a narration of deeds and adventures, of heroes or legendary figures that's often tied to the history of a nation. Like the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh was originally written in Akkadian on tablets. Both of these stories are epics because they are tied to the history of the nation of Babylon. Now that we've reached the end of this presentation, you should be able to use terms like Israelite, Judaism, etc. in proper context. Explain the situation of Israel in the geography of the ancient Near East, including its climate, produce, and trade market. Explain the overall development of history in the ancient Near East from the early Bronze Age to the Roman period, particularly focusing on Israel's role in this history. Explain how archaeology can be used to study ancient geography and history. And summarize and identify important characters in the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh.